welcome all to this first session of the conference today. And the goal of the session, as Manny mentioned, is to look at inequality in impact evaluations. Just to make an example of what the problem is as we see it, I would like to mention a study that we recently completed in the office in London, which is a systematic review of education intervention in developing countries, in low and middle income countries. And in this study, we reviewed something like 247 impact evaluations. And we look at the impact of a wide range of interventions on students' achievements in terms of attainment, attendance, test scores. And by the way, the interventions are successful. Interventions are actually improving achievement test score. So the impact, there is an impact, and funds and money is not wasted. But when we did the internal review of the report, one thing that we asked the researchers was, can you do a breakdown of the results by sex? Can we see the results, what are the difference in results between boys and girls? And they came back to say, no, we can't do that. And the reason why you can do that is because the primary studies were not reporting any disaggregation of any sort in the majority, right? So there was no way of summarizing the results by group and not even by sex of the pupil or the child. So we feel that this is a problem at 3IE. There's both a general problem in issue, and as Manny mentioned, we focus on the average effects, but we normally forget that actually interventions are targeted and to improve the living conditions of particular groups. So the goal of the session today, trying to discuss why this is happening or what we can do about it. And we have invited 3 speakers who have lots of experience in the area, particularly on gender, and to talk about what could be the reason for studies not being able or not willing to do an analysis by gender or by other groups. Is it a problem of data collection? Is it a problem of cost, or is it a conceptual issue? So we'll try to, so we have small presentations first, and then we will have open the debate and to open questions in the room. So I would like to invite our speakers. The first speaker was actually will be Agnes Kizumbing. Just I'm going to give a quick introduction. Agnes is a senior research fellow at IFPRI in the Poverty and Health Nutrition divisions. And she's also leading the cross-cutting gender team at IFPRI. She has long experience of work in agriculture, poverty, and gender in particular. Second speaker is Marcus Goldstein. He's a lead economist at the office of the chief economist for the African region, and he's also lead of Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank. And our third speaker is Roxanne, who is the program manager for a humanitarian center of the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University. And she has a long experience of working on humanitarian issues and conflict and gender.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to speak at this Evidence Week. So the topic of this general panel is on looking at inequality and impact evaluations. And most of my career has been focused at looking at gender inequality, so that's what I'm going to look at. And I guess even though so many programs are designed to, quote unquote, air quote, benefit women and girls, there are impact evaluations that actually looked at gendered impacts are quite rare. I mean, good impact evaluations are quite rare. And so what I want to do in sort of as an introduction to this topic is to look at the barriers to impact evaluations that meaningfully and rigorously consider gendered impacts. And there are 3. One is conceptual, knowing what to measure. Second is measurement, having the right indicators. And the third is design, having a conscious objective of measuring gendered impacts from the start. I forgot to mention a fourth constraint, budget, but we can talk about that later. So in terms of knowing what to measure, there's often a confusion between gender and sex, and I don't want to do gender 101 in this panel, but basically what we're trying to understand is what are the socially determined roles of men and women and how do they affect outcomes of programs. So it's very common that some programs or some impact evaluations will only measure outcomes of women. That's not the way to examine gender inequality because you want to look at the outcomes of women relative to men. However, that said, there are some outcomes which may be very sex-specific. For example, maternal mortality, obviously, only women die from maternal mortality. Even it may be a symptom of underlying gender inequality if, for example, women don't have access to prenatal health or to primary health care. Another pet peeve of mine is to compare male and female-headed households as a way to measure gendered impact. Now, there are many reasons why this really isn't the state of the art in terms of looking at gender inequality. One is that it doesn't look at differences between men and women within male-headed households. Male-headed households in most countries still make up the majority of the population. And secondly, it neglects the differences between female-headed households. They are quite different in the reasons why they became female-headed, whether it's through widowhood, whether it's because the woman decided to stay single or to leave a marriage because she has the resources to support herself outside that marriage. There's also an issue of the power to detect impact if you have disaggregations like that, which Marcus will talk about. The second issue is a measurement issue, having the right indicators. So I argue that indicators at the individual level are the best indicators to use to measure gender inequality. So we have human capital outcomes, your schooling, health status, etc., individual incomes. Household level indicators are often blunt instruments, and in my area, which is agriculture, most agricultural surveys, with the exception of a few, don't always collect sex-disaggregated data on factors of production, for example, on agricultural assets. What would be ideal is to have individual level indicators on men and women, boys and girls within the same household. So I often feel embarrassed to mention this in a crowd like this because you all have done impact evaluations or are busy commissioning them, but you would be surprised how many impact evaluations I've seen which don't even collect a good household roster. I was reviewing proposals by grantees of a donor, I think, who is quite common to us. And I was surprised that the information, the ID information, just had information about the person, and we had no idea about that person's relationship to anybody else within the household. The third thing is design. So if you're going to design an impact evaluation to measure gendered impacts, it would be really great if you took it into account at baseline. Have enough power to detect gendered impacts, larger sample size, making sure you have enough in the relevant categories. When you choose your study population, be sensitive to the age range in which impacts can be detected. If you're looking at nutritional outcomes, for example, you have a lot more sensitivity to intervention in the 0 to 2 and possibly in the 3 to 5, less so as the kids become school age. And be aware that the relevant study population may be context-specific. I'm going to talk about this later on when I talk about an impact evaluation that we're doing at IFPRI right now. But for example, if we're looking at an ag nutrition intervention targeted to women who could potentially become pregnant. The childbearing age in Bangladesh is still low, but family sizes are small, which means that you have to target a very specific group of women if you want to look at impact. Now, what if you didn't pay attention to gender at baseline? Okay, this is time to scratch your head like, oh no, why did I not pay attention to gender at baseline? So there are some fixes. They aren't always easy. In some cases, they may be impossible. Just do a new study. If you have a study that is well designed, you may be able to retrofit. So I'm going to talk about two examples. One is a retrofitting example, and one is a designing from scratch example. So I think most people in this room know about the impact evaluation that Oriana Bandiera and others have done of BRAC's targeting the ultra-poor program, which is an asset transfer program. although the transfers were targeted to women, of the livestock transfers are targeted to women, the initial evaluation didn't really look at gendered asset impacts. So what we wanted to do is we retrofitted an impact evaluation which already had a good design. It was randomized. So the question that we wanted to answer are whether asset transfers stick to the recipients. And this is work done by Shalini Roy, Narayan Das, Jinat Ara, and myself. So we focused on the second part of Brack's TUP, which was an RCT. The Bandiera et al. Work shows large positive impacts at the household level, but there was little evidence then of the inter-household impacts of TUP. So to look at this, we first did qualitative work, which was done before the Endline survey, to understand how men and women in the study areas conceptualize asset ownership, what it means to have sole control of an asset, what it means to have joint control of an asset. Based on that qualitative work, we designed an add-on module on gendered asset ownership and who owned the assets. And that was added on to the Endline. Now, because this wasn't administered at baseline, we couldn't do difference in difference. But because the treatment was randomized, we could do single difference estimates of differences between male-owned, female-owned, and jointly owned assets between treatment and control groups. So this paper is in JDE 2015, so I'm not going to talk about great detail. But just to summarize the key findings, the program increased asset ownership at the household level. But in terms of the inter-household effects, there were mixed effects. Okay, it did increase women's ownership and control over transferred livestock, but there was a greater increase in men's sole ownership over other forms of new investment in assets, like land, for example. Women's mobility outside the home went down because the transferred asset, which was typically a cow, a goat, maybe some chickens, required maintenance inside the household. And it also reduced women's voice in a range of decisions. So this was consistent with models which related relative resource control to inter-household bargaining, because women didn't have to leave the house. They didn't participate in a lot of market-oriented decisions. But if you take into account intangibles and context, the effects on targeted women appear more favorable, even if a bit ambiguous. Because the program enabled them to have better access to clothing, they felt that they no longer felt ashamed about going out and meeting people. The social capital improved. Women actually preferred working at home, even though there was reduced mobility, because of the really horrible labor market conditions for poor women in rural Bangladesh. And women themselves framed the project impacts more in terms of intangibles like self-esteem, satisfaction in contributing to household and children's well-being, rather than individual rights or material gains. So this is an example of a study in which retrofitting worked, because the baselines, the original impact evaluation was well designed. Now, if we were going to design an impact evaluation from the start, how would you do it to look at gendered impacts? So I'm going to talk about a new RCT which is ongoing, which is called the Targeting and Realigning Agriculture for Improved Nutrition, TRAIN. This is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and DFID. And it has a range of objectives related to increasing dietary diversity, child feeding, IYCF practices, using behavior change communications as a vehicle, empowering women, and it wants to look at impacts on maternal and child nutrition outcomes. There are 4 treatment arms. The base is a microcredit program which provides credit to women, so everybody receives this. Then there is a comprehensive BCC program, Behavior Change Communication Program, which is based on Brack's Alive and Thrive BCC model, and that's given to one group. To the other groups. And then there is an agriculture extension services focused on improving agricultural income and production diversity targeted to men and women. And finally, a last treatment arm which looks at social mobilization. So each of these treatment arms are additive. So, so it asks about the value added of adding a BCC platform to an agricultural credit program targeted to women. And then what is the value added of nutrition-sensitive ag extension services targeted to both men and women to the credit program plus the BCC intervention? And then if we added ag extension services to men and women, to those two other things, what is the value added? And lastly, what's the value added of including a gender sensitization component? So there are a number of primary outcomes at the woman and child level, as well as the household level. And what I'd like to point out is that getting the right sample, designing around this sample was actually quite tricky. For one, how do you identify the target woman for the intervention? The existing credit program, the beneficiary women were older. As I mentioned earlier, total fertility rates in Bangladesh have declined, and most women attain their desired family size at around 25 years of age. And we didn't want to overburden women who had very young children or who were pregnant, so it's a do no harm. So instead of targeting an individual within a household, we selected the whole household to be a beneficiary if it satisfied the following criteria. You had a female member who was a part of the credit program. The married female, there was a married female household member in age group 15 to 28 years, which is in the age during which childbearing would take place. And have a co-resident husband so that we could look at intra-household effects. So we were not comparing men and women in different households. We wanted to compare those within the same household. And so because the household is the beneficiary, broad BCC messages on nutrition would be provided to the household, and more specific maternal and child nutrition BCC to the index woman. So final thoughts. So I see Eduardo scribbling, so I have to go quickly to final thoughts. Okay. Pay attention to measuring gendered impacts from the start. If you think about it ahead of time, if it's not an afterthought, you'll be more intentional in framing the study and in finding out what the indicators that you want to measure are. Although I have talked mostly about gendered impacts, we also need to look at differences by age, by socioeconomic status. Understanding heterogeneous impact is often key to understanding inequality and the way that programs actually work in the real world. Second, use the right indicators. There has been a lot of work now on developing sex-disaggregated data and indicators that can be used to measure things like, which were formerly unmeasurable, like women's empowerment. Design your study so that you have enough power to detect impact, which Marcus will talk about. And finally, recognize that gender norms are context-specific. So I've talked mostly about quantitative impact evaluations, but these also need to invest in high-quality, qualitative work to understand the how and why of your findings. And ideally, the qualitative work would not be done as an afterthought either, but done from the start and very consciously as part of the impact evaluation process. Thank you.
So when Eduardo asked us to speak, he said, one of the big questions is, why don't we see more of this disaggregation? And the example that we heard at the very beginning about people not putting this, not having this to hand, speaks to that emptiness. So my simple answer is that it's a question of power. But power, as we all know, is a complicated thing. So what I'd like to do is show you one way this manifests. But first, taking a step back and sort of building on what Agnes was saying, when we think about, and so one other caveat to make is what I'm going to say is about the case of gender, because that's what I work on, but a lot of these apply to different groups that are disadvantaged that you might want to look at. So it's more general, that you would change certain things, but that a lot of the ideas hold through. So when we think about the gender impacts of policies or interventions, we can think of sort of three slices. One is sort of male versus female beneficiaries. So who gets the programs? Agnes talked about the second case as well, which is spillover benefits. So if somebody in my household is a beneficiary, who else in the household is benefiting? And trying to understand those effects, which is going to have gender dimensions as well. And then a third, which can be combined with the others, is the differences in male versus female sensitivity or responsiveness to an intervention. So what this means is that you think there are different causal chains for program impacts for men versus women. Now, before I start unpacking this in a little more detail, I want to take a side trip to talk about survey design. So Agnes was talking about different kind of indicators and thinking about that measurement question. This has very clear implications with cost implications for how we design our surveys, right? So if we're thinking about male versus female beneficiaries, we're going to think about, well, we may want to interview men versus women separately for some questions. We may want to interview them together for some questions. We might want to use enumerators of different sexes. When we're thinking about spillover benefits, it gets even more complicated, because then the question is, am I going to talk about the impacts on my children? Are you going to ask my wife? Why? Why are you going to ask my wife? Why are you going to ask me? So there's some interesting work, for example, right now, just trying to measure household control of assets that's going on in Uganda. There's a technical report, so if you Google Killick Mexa, you'll find it. And it's kind of fascinating to see what people will tell you about other people in their household. Yes, just go ask my wife. So the final thing is, when we're thinking about of course, it gets more complicated. If we're thinking about differences in responsiveness to the program across males and females, we might even want different questionnaires for men and women, and your enumerators will then promptly mess that up. So that it makes things much more complicated, because what if she's not there and we have to ask somebody else? And but that very much speaks to that. We're going to want different indicators, maybe at different levels, not just the outcome indicators, but throughout. Okay. So getting back to this broader power question, when we think about the gender analysis, and we're looking at just a sort of simple gender difference, the hypothesis we're testing is whether the gender difference is statistically different from zero. Now, what I think often gets lost, particularly in policy discussions, is there are two ways this can happen. All right? The first way this can happen is there may or may not be a gender difference from the point of view of statistical significance. The estimates are so noisy, they're not statistically different from zero, and that's what the researcher is going to tell the policymaker. But there could be a huge difference, okay? And that's not policy useful at all. And that's, well, I'm not gonna waste the punchline now. But and the second, which is very policy relevant, is the difference is actually zero, and it's well estimated. So there was a very interesting paper recently by Oriana Bandiera and some co-authors looking at the difference in gender responsiveness to pay for performance across the world. And that's a very precise zero, okay, and policy relevant. All right, let me give you some examples of some gender results, and then I'll come back and talk about how those hypotheses relate. So the first example is a paper by Genet and Yang, looking at rainfall insurance in Malawi. So these are loans that are tied to the adoption of high-yielding varieties. Punchline is fewer farmers take the loan when it's tied to insurance. There's an explanation in the paper. But when they do the gender analysis, there's no significant difference. Second is a paper by Ashraf, Jinnah, and Carlin looking at technological adoption in Kenya. Here they provide a package of things, including credit, extension, and export services to farmers to adopt export crops. They find that they do grow these crops. There's no big outcomes on income and harvest value, but again, no significant difference across male and female farmers. Third is a paper that's had a fair amount of influence in thinking about subsidies and fertilizer use by Duflo, Kramer, and Robinson. This is a mechanism to get farmers to commit to buying fertilizer early and they compare that to a subsidy, a large subsidy, and these well-timed discounts actually outperform the subsidy. Again, when they run their regressions by male and female farmers, there's no significant difference. The fourth, which is a source of my own personal frustration, is some work we're doing right now on business training in Togo. And so what this is doing is comparing two different kinds of business training. One is your more standard, it's actually a World Bank product, your standard managerial training, teaching you the sort of how to keep books and da-da-da-da. The second, which I think is much more interesting, is comes from psychology, and it teaches you how to think like an entrepreneur rather than just keep books. And here are some of the early results. They're still in progress. But if you look at, again, the gender differences, they're not statistically significant. So this would fall into the vein of the three papers we just saw. When we look within men, and this, by the way, was designed to capture gender differences. When you look within men, and it's cut off at the bottom, there is not a statistical difference across the two types of training. You see somewhat different coefficients there, 16 versus 26,000 CFA in terms of monthly profits. But they're not statistically different from each other. So for men, we can't say which is the better training. But if we also ask the question for women, which is the better training, which is the last column, we can say with some statistical significance that 32,000 is bigger than 4,000. And that this personal initiative, this non-cognitive skills-based training works much better for women. So that altogether, looking across these four papers, it's a lot of insignificant results. And you're all saying to yourself, well, this man just wasted 15 minutes of my time listening to not significant results. So remember, there's just one point here in this presentation. We're testing these hypotheses, right? Whether the gender difference is different from zero. And there are two ways it can happen. And for almost all of those papers, actually, that I just showed you, it's the first type. We can't tell that some of these coefficients are sizable, and we can't tell, okay? So they're not useful for policymakers. So why? Well, the problem is, in general, across a lot of these studies, is statistical power. So when we do an evaluation, we do power calculations. So here are some examples of power calculations, two outcomes, two countries. We're looking at loan take-up in South Africa, land market participation in Ghana. So this is using data from evaluations. So if we're looking for a 25% detectable impact in those outcomes, the samples are in that first column of numbers, okay? So in South Africa, we're looking for 4,000 to 7,000. If we want half again gender differences, okay? So women have half again as much or half again less, all right? With some sort of basic assumptions, the samples are in the second column. All right, so our 4,000 to 7,000 goes from 18 to 28,000. Similarly, in Ghana, you can see our 700 to 1,100 sample blows up to somewhere between 2,800 to 4,400. There's a pattern to these numbers, all right, and the basic rule of thumb here is that to look for a half again gender difference, so a 15% percentage point increase for men, let's say, we would be looking for 22 or more, or 8 or less for women. We need 4 times the sample, okay? And that blows up a lot. And this isn't even getting more complicated. So part of the reason for those results that I showed you in Togo is that men are noisy. And the male variance on profits, for the variable we were looking at, is 1.78 times that of the female, right? So there's a lot more variation in the male profits than there is in the female. Not such a huge difference in the means, but a lot in the variation. So just let me close with a couple of thoughts. To really build the evidence base on gender or other forms of inequality, we need bigger surveys. And we need to think about, as Agnes was saying, we really need to think about incorporating this at the beginning, because it's going to affect our sample size as well as the questions we ask, who we ask them to, what variables we're measuring. And we need to get beyond this gender dummy as afterthought, right? Which leads to a lot of insignificant results that some people interpret, I think, in the wrong way. So this means that the folks who do the evaluations have to pay attention to this ex ante, have to think about it at the beginning. It means more money. You have to say to your funders, look, I'm sorry, but if you really want to know about the youth or about gender, then you have to pay more. And here's how much more. And then, of course, the results have to get used for policymaking. And this, altogether, is a question of power. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in a basement to talk about power with all of you this morning. My name is Roxanne Cristalli, and I manage the Humanitarian Evidence Program, which is a partnership between Oxfam and the Feinstein International Center at Tufts. The goal of the program is to synthesize existing evidence-based research in the humanitarian field on which interventions work, which do not work, and what is their effect on particular outcomes of interest. And so to do that, we've commissioned 8 systematic reviews on humanitarian topics, all of which were released in the past week. So you can imagine how fun this week has been for us, as well as standalone briefing papers and executive summaries for the policymakers who won't read the full review. In addition to those, we've produced guidance documents and reflections papers, and that's what I will be previewing with you today. And you can see the review topic areas here, and you'll be relieved to hear that that is the end of my slides, and the rest of it will be conversation. And so one thing we've learned from this process is that evidence is itself a form of gatekeeping. What counts as evidence itself both reflects and produces inequalities, and therefore evidence is a site of power. And that is something that we don't actually engage with enough. And so I will talk about 5 ways in which this is manifested in gendered and other ways through the course of the program. The first is completely ignoring masculinity. So one thing we did when we commissioned these systematic reviews, so these are not evaluations in themselves, although they engage with them. They're also not prospective research, right? They synthesize existing evidence-based research rather than conducting new fieldwork. So one thing we did when we commissioned them is we said, we want you to report on gender, age, race, and class disaggregated interventions and outcomes whenever possible. And people said, well, the data just isn't there, as though that's not a data point in itself. So we found it to be very important to actually be able to turn around and tell both DFID and Oxfam, who commissioned field research, and ourselves, who also commissioned field research, that the data isn't there, as opposed to just not reporting on it, that it's not there. That's a different intervention. The second was the ignorance around masculinity. We would sometimes turn around and ask our authors, could you tell us about gender disaggregated outcomes? And they would say, there's nothing on women and girls, as though women and girls are the only gendered subjects who experience power in the humanitarian field. And I'll give you a couple of specific examples where this really matters. I manage an ongoing study in Greece at the moment on the refugee crisis. And a lot of the gender findings on the refugee crisis have been about women and girls, completely missing sexual assault against males, transactional sex among males, male-male interactions with smugglers, and so on and so forth. In part because the funding, as Marcus pointed out, on the gender line item is often limited to women and girls. And so what is it that we've tried to do? We've tried to broaden the definition of gender, and the indicators rather, to explicitly include men and masculinities as sites of power and their relationships within the category. So not just looking at men and women, but which men? What is the difference between the men who experience an intervention a certain way and the others who experience it another way, as opposed to treating men and women as unproblematized, holistic categories within themselves? The third thing that we found is that very often we're seeing gender pitted against other categories. And how gender became part of the global agenda is also a question of power, right? It took a lot of organizing from researchers, from activists, from lobbyists to get to sex-disaggregated data and to get gender to be taken seriously. And when we try to add other parameters, for example, in a study in Colombia on victims, trying to add the dimension of race, so we can look at Afro-Colombians, or indigenous status, so we can look at indigenous victims of the conflict, we're often told we're doing gender already. We cannot possibly add on yet another factor of power. And we find this deeply problematic. First of all, because it pits these factors of marginalization against each other, right? It's like the white, male, middle class can remain the assumed category, and we can just add one other as opposed to all of them. And secondly, because it treats evaluation and research as atheoretical, uncritical, technocratic enterprises, right? As opposed to letting us engage explicitly with power. So what do we do there? We've actually asked our authors of the reviews, but also prospective researchers working on this, to attempt to broaden this themselves and to try to collect data on race, on indigenous status, on class. Otherwise, our data is itself problematic because we end up saying women as opposed to asking which women and assuming they all experience a phenomenon in a particular way that is holistic, which is itself incredibly misleading when you think about how people experience humanitarian crisis. The fourth thing that we found problematic is to the extent that the data is there and that allows for synthesis, it focuses really narrowly on identities, so male or female, and it misses structures of power, relationships, and systems. And what do we mean by that? Again, in the Colombia research example, laws are structured in ways that women in particular areas cannot inherit land, or only certain people can make a claim with the victims unit, or literacy is assumed. There are all these things that are power assumptions built into the particular context that if you just disaggregate based on maleness or femaleness, you're not going to get at the ways in which the system itself is already gendered, is already racialized, and is already classed. And that is where, as Agnes and Marcus pointed out, the qualitative work is really key. So understanding what are the ways in which the system, the structures, the networks, and the relationships are already sites of gendered power and racialized power and class power is the only way to improve the data on this. The next thing we discovered, and Marcus alluded to this, and I'd like to give a couple more specific examples, is this idea of the narrative responsibility and who bears the gendered burden of evaluation, particularly on who bears the gendered burden of evaluation on gender. So what we frequently found, particularly at the very last minute, is there's a panicked evaluator who's trying to meet their terms of reference that require them to report on gender. So on the second to last day, they go out and find some women and ask them about whether they've experienced gender-based violence. I see a lot of nods in the room because I think we've all seen that phenomenon, but it's actually more subtle than just looking for the women and looking for gender-based violence. Some of it, as Marcus said, is whom do we direct questions about caretaking to, right? Whom do we ask, what is the distribution of tasks within the household, what did the children eat, and so on. And again, if the men say, talk to the wife, that's a data point. That's a gender data point that requires qualitative reporting. That is interesting as part of those power structures. Other sites where we're seeing this, questions around perpetration, particularly in humanitarian contexts and particularly on conflict, are directed at men. We're assuming men are perpetrators of violence and that women aren't. Similarly, questions around victimhood, very often not directed at men, particularly when it comes to sexual violence. And so we're missing a lot of the data that is actually relevant there. Questions around leadership, financial decision-making, already themselves gendered in whom we direct them to and whom we analyze the data around. And here it's not just a question around, well, you should also ask the women whether they perpetrated violence or ask the men whether they experienced rape. It's not as simple as that. It has to do with how do you train people to present themselves? Because as we found, if you show up in the middle of northern Uganda and you say, we're studying sexual violence against males, no one's going to talk to you, because that is not how people want to be identified. And so thinking about the presentation of the evaluator, the framing of the research, the framing of the questions, if you're actually trying to get at these particular sites of power. And finally, we see evaluation and research as interventions in themselves. We're not just studying interventions, we're intervening in doing this. So thinking about what are the incentives not to speak to an evaluator about gender, or what are the ways in which the data is already biased, not just statistically, but structurally within the system, is something that we need to take into account. We're happy to answer questions, and thank you very much.
To Marcus, that sort of relates to some of the other discussion, and that is, does qualitative data help you at all with respect to either formulating your questions or in terms of trying to interpret some of the results that may not be very clear?
So my question is a very simple one, Agnes. If I'm disaggregating the analysis by sex, is that a gender analysis or not? And the question for Roxanne is, I think many of the examples that you made were about looking at small groups. Mm-hmm. And but the presentation that Marcus made was that you need large samples, right? So how do you reconcile that? Can you do an analysis of data on small groups, and how?
I think one of the other factors which you did not mention that may contributing to the lack of data, disaggregated data on gender and other categories is the people who do these evaluations. Are they trained sufficiently? I mean, you mentioned Gender 101. It's really fundamental for the evaluation team members to be really familiar with the gender concepts. So I think that it's a very critical factor, and not everyone is a gender expert, and so but all evaluators, I think, if they're looking at gender issues, should have some basic knowledge of those concepts.
I actually have two questions. One that came up after listening to this last question. Roxanne, you mentioned that about the importance of framing the study and how the even enumerators would present the research. And I think that's a really good point, and I'm wondering if you have any examples of ways that you've found to do that. My second question would be for all of the panelists, I think, about how we go beyond disaggregated measures of gendered impact, and in particular some of the measures around household decision making or gender norms or perceptions. If you could speak a little bit about ways you've seen that done well or some of the challenges.
So the question asked was, what's the difference between sex disaggregated data and gender analysis? They are often confused. And I think that sex disaggregated data, you could interpret it as being something mechanical. It's collect based on biological difference. So you have, for example, differences in years of schooling of men and women, differences in years of schooling between boys and girls. But gender analysis will go to the social factors which are responsible for those differences and also the consequences of having those differences. And I think that is where taking the context into account is really very important, because a difference in one society may mean something very different in another society. So, for example, the factors for for example, if you're going to look at something as simple as for years of schooling, say of adolescents, you often see a lot of discussion about, we really need to educate adolescent girls and all that. And then say all programs should try to increase adolescent girls' schooling, not paying attention to the fact that in some regions, girls have actually surpassed boys in schooling. So, for example, areas of Latin America. So the interventions there might better be targeted to boys. So I think a gender analysis means that you take a broader look at the context when you look at sex disaggregated data, but you need them both.
Does qualitative work help? It can. So the ideal infinite budget evaluation would be qual. It's help you figure out a lot of what Roxanne was talking about. So that's a very expensive qual. Then you design your quantitative, you do your quantitative, then you do the qual during to understand what's going on and the impacts. Then you do your quantitative, then you get those results really quickly. And then you do qual to understand what you may have missed. And then you go back maybe and do some more analysis on the quant. We can stop collecting data at this point. So I think, so that's the ideal. I've seen it work. I've seen it not work. In particular, in the first stage, I think it's so wide open when you're trying to figure out, there's a causal theory that the program has in mind, and it's good to interrogate that, and that might help you understand, but you have to be somewhat, I think, where I've seen that go wrong or be less useful, I think it's been interesting in its own right, but less useful for the purposes of the evaluation, is when it's just all over the place and it's kind of hard to nail down. So I think starting with the causal chain of the program and moving out from there is useful. This question, this comment on training, I agree, but not everyone's going to do it. And so I think this movement to having data more available, along with the code you used to produce the results, I think is critical. Because then other people can, so this Bandiera paper I mentioned was an ex post work with a whole bunch of other people's data sets, some of their own, but mostly from other people. And, when you ask them, that was an insane amount of work and arm twisting and getting people to part with the data because they hadn't done these regressions, right? But the data was there. And so trying to get people to give up the data so that you can go back and do the analysis, but you also have to be able to reproduce what they did as a starting point, because that's the jumping off point. So I think that's really important. And then this question on getting beyond disaggregation, there's lots to do. So just two quick examples. One is jumping off from what Roxanne and Agnes were both talking about, is we're doing some work is that the program really worked differently for men and women. So we're doing some work on business registration in Malawi, fairly straightforward interventions. No difference in sort of how they approach gender issues. But the way the program worked, the outcomes are actually identical. They're good and equal. And we had power for that, so they're fairly precisely equal. But the way the program worked is totally different for men and women. And it has to do with how they interacted with the banks and the financial services they took as a result of this program. And that is super interesting. And there's a lot to be learned for designing these programs and thinking about scale. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. These are great questions. I'll bundle a few of them together. The first on the framing and how do you frame it so that you're not asking, we're here to talk to men about whether they've experienced sexual violence. And I think there's a balance between, honesty, authenticity, and good research practice that needs to be struck there. A few things we found that work. So both in that Northern Uganda study and in Colombia, framing it as we're researching experiences of violence during the conflict, which actually allowed us to ask about perpetration and victimhood to groups across genders without necessarily labeling it as such. Another was working with clinics. One thing that the qualitative work showed is men are much less likely to report sexual violence as such, but it comes up as a secondary issue. What does that mean? They'll come in for an injury or an after effect or something that requires medical care, and it will come up over the course of that consultation. So figuring out how do we build data collection into existing data collection practices, and how do we deal with the ethics of that and the power dynamics already embedded in that. And work with local clinicians and people who navigate these questions to build better data collection was very key. The second on qualitative data and this question of large samples and small groups. One thing I find as a feminist qualitative researcher is the group is small is a way that we have of discrediting and marginalizing certain types of knowledge, right? It's like, well, if it's not true for 1 million people, we're not interested, which is actually how you wipe out power dynamics. So what does that mean about how we do our work? In the refugee study that I referenced in Greece, we had originally designed the study to be around refugees, which is a really broad, unproblematized category. And then we got to Greece and we assumed we would mostly be talking to Syrians. And it turned out that there were massive differences between Syrians, Afghans who had fled during the war, Eritreans, and other West Africans who found their way to Greece. And so without ethnic disaggregation, actually, the data was useless. And so what did that mean we had to do? We went back to the donor and we said, actually, we need to disaggregate the category because when we say refugees, it's not particularly helpful and we need to break it down by ethnicity. They couldn't pay for it, so we parceled it out. We went to a different donor and we said, we have this study funded by somebody else. And we think there's potential to do some really interesting work on refugees and ethnicity, refugees and gender. Would you be interested in paying for that component of the work? And they did. That did mean we had to do more work in the fundraising stage, in the design stage, in the reporting stage, because we're reporting to 8 different people at the moment. But it also means the results are ones that we can stand behind with more confidence. And the last thing I wanted to say is this point on norms, qualitative data, and disaggregation. I think qualitative data is essential for getting to the norms question and to the power questions and to the how questions. It's not like, well, it's great if you can get it. It's that I think you miss sites of power and you miss dynamics beyond individual identity without it. And so you miss the relationships, the networks, the systems, the structures. And so to get to Eduardo's question, if disaggregating by sex is gender analysis, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient because gender analysis requires those systems and structures that just sex disaggregation at the level of identity will not get at.
Thank you. These are very interesting presentations. And from the perspective of a donor, it is somewhat terrifying. Wonderful. I mean, very interesting information to find out. But then how do we plan for, how do we budget for these? How do we, take into account the fact that you might need more funds afterwards to find out more things? The thought of needing 4 times the sample size for a survey can be somewhat terrifying from the sort of perspective of the implementer or of the donor funding the evaluation. So I guess I have one question for all the speakers and maybe a reaction to something that Marcus said. The question in general is, how would you prefer that the funding be structured to be able to take some of these considerations into account? So, for example, you arrived in Greece at a refugee camp, and only then did you realize that there were differences between the types of refugees that you had to take into account. So, would it be sort of funding a preliminary pilot investigation, and only after that figure out how much, what you actually need to, what questions do you need to ask, and how do you go about answering them? So that's the first question. And then the reaction is, to Marcus, just in all cases, does the subgroup analysis require a larger sample size? So is it possible that, it turns out that there are effect sizes for women that are much larger than for everyone else in this household, and so therefore you would need to interview fewer women because there's so much larger a sample size. So can that give us hope?
With regard to data availability and the disaggregation of data, I would like to suggest the political environment. What is your experience when it's like politically not allowed actually to have a certain type of data? I'm thinking of, I come from Mauritania. I'm sure you know what I'm thinking about. So how would you sort of overcome this political barrier? Technically speaking, and also I guess there are questions on the composition and of the I would say the researchers themselves, because not any kind or any type of researcher would be allowed to ask any type of question or go in some areas or things like that. So what is your experience?
Hi. I guess this is a question for the panel, but Ms. Costelli, I think, said some things around it. We didn't talk about disadvantaged groups. None of you mentioned disadvantaged groups, and I think the questioner just before me was sort of alluding to that. And how do we actually sort of? There aren't that many randomized studies that actually pick up, except for poverty, and pick up issues around discrimination, for example. Even in India, you don't find that much research on caste problems. And the other question is that there's a very nice article, I think by Angus Deaton, 2007, Journal of Economic Literature, about health inequality. There, he emphasizes the pathways to inequalities. How do we pick that up? Perhaps systematic reviews can pick that up. I did a study in India where, in Uttar Pradesh, on women, it's maternal health, and we had actually an uptake of the program, higher uptake of the program by the lower caste, and which I actually presumed because the low caste, there was a low caste chief minister in Uttar Pradesh in India. And the women in Uttar Pradesh, lower caste women in Uttar Pradesh felt empowered. Now, so I presume that was one of the reasons we had such success in Uttar Pradesh. So my question is, how do we sort of capture how discrimination occurs? And how do we, and the pathway to discrimination is much more important, as important as that there is discrimination.
Evaluator from Togo, Minister of Planning. When I saw the thematic, it was very interesting. I will read it. Whose impact, inequality, gender, and disadvantaged groups in impact evaluation? Very interesting. We are in the Ministry of Planning. When we want to make planning, we have different sectors: agricultural, food security, environment, water, education, health, so and so on. How we can plan the things that in the same time, the impact evaluation will include different sectors, like that. I don't know how, but when we want to make evaluation, we make evaluation from one program, different program, without making in the same time, because they are, every program begin in different period, not in the same period. How we can make evaluation in the same time to cross different effects which concern gender, inequality, and so on. That is why I want to know in which mind we will have now what can be that evaluation, because I cannot see myself in the evaluation, because program of agricultural is doing left, this right, and another behind, and after when we make evaluation program by program. How we can make program by program and we will see effect which can cross inequality or something like that. I cannot, I brief, but difficult for me to understand. That is why I want to give my that question to explain me. Thank you.
The donor question, I thought you'd never ask. This is really exciting. I would say we've thought a lot about this, and I will reframe it to say, what have we found the donors who are most receptive to good gender analysis have done well, and how do we replicate that, right? The first is this beyond women and girls phenomenon, really pushing for analysis within the category, which women, which girls, analysis of masculinity, analysis of sexuality, and so on and so forth. Because otherwise what you end up with is the checkbox approach where, you know, on May 30th, the day before your report is due, you pull out the women and girls data and you write a paragraph and you call that gender analysis. So unless donors demand more nuanced gender analysis, I don't think we'll move forward. The second is appreciating both how difficult and how expensive qualitative work is, which I think Marcus alluded to before this. And I'll give an example without naming the donor. I think this is called subtweeting on Twitter, where you often see these calls for proposals that say you have $1 million for preferably 6 sites over 2 months, These comparison groups and so on and so forth, essentially a design that makes it really hard to do in-depth qualitative work. So when proposals are valued that have more sites or more indicators, less time at each site, and less complex research and evaluation interventions, it makes it really hard to do qualitative work. So I think appreciating the length of time and the expense that good in-depth qualitative work requires is very helpful. The third is the pilot study, which you alluded to yourself. I think had we had a pilot study, we would have easily figured out this ethnicity question. But in the absence of a pilot study, we really welcomed flexibility, where we basically said, with the money we have, if we're not going to change the money we have, if we're going to do this ethnicity analysis, we're going to need to cut this other aspect of the work plan. And our approach was, we'd rather do two things really well than just a broad stroke approach, and this is how refugees experience crises, when refugees is not a meaningful, sensitive enough category. So having flexibility from different donors to adjust the work plan along the way in the name of getting to those power inequalities was really helpful. And then I think donor collaboration. So what we found in this case is we got somebody else to pay for the gender analysis and someone else to pay for a different site. And that hasn't always been the case. We have had the types of grants where it's one donor funds all. They basically own the project and own its research process. And that means that you're pretty constricted in terms of what you can do. Quickly to the other two questions. The political environment question, you're spot on. It's linked to the disadvantaged groups question as well. There's a lot of literature on doing work with hidden and hard to access populations, right? And a lot of it came from how do you do evaluations on LGBT issues, where asking in places where asking about them is itself quite dangerous. I would say at a minimum, in the write-up expressly noting that this data didn't get collected as opposed to having it be a blind spot is incredibly important. So saying we did not ask about this for these reasons, and therefore this is a parameter that did not get analyzed but very much affected people's experience of crises, is essential. Another thing that we found, again on the refugee study, where it's not incredibly easy to ask Syrian refugees about their sexuality, is we had a sort of catch-all question in the qualitative of, is there an aspect of your identity that we didn't discuss that you think has affected your experience of displacement? And that sort of opened a window to people who wanted to talk about it, to give us a sense. And it also informed our research process, because then we would test out with them what is appropriate, what is not, and attempt to get at it that way. Finally, the disadvantaged groups question. I would say the question is disadvantaged by whom and in what way, right? Because disadvantage isn't fixed. It's like inequality, like repression. It moves and it shifts across contexts. So a couple of really good practices I've seen at getting to this. In Colombia, at an evaluation of the victims unit, which is basically a ministry of victims. It's a government level cabinet position that deals with the 8.2 million registered victims of the conflict and has a variety of programs. The World Bank is running the evaluation. One thing they found is a lot of people whose livelihood depends on land and on day labor are not going to go all the way into the victims unit for the evaluation itself. So for the evaluation, they created something called the mobile victims unit, which is basically a food truck. Like, it's a truck that looks like a food truck that goes out to those populations to collect data in their context in order to attempt to get at some of the power inequalities of research and knowledge that are built into the system. And I've seen other practices like this that I'm happy to discuss.
Okay, so I'll start with the budget question. Just to add to what Roxana said, I think it requires donors to prioritize which of the projects they want to go in depth on this, because it will usually cost more. So you pointed to the other part of your question was about when will we get lucky and not need a larger sample. And the answer is when the effects are huge, right? And very different. So we had a really super low budget evaluation of a pilot land title registration program in Rwanda. And we got lucky. The effects for women on investment were twice what they were for men, and this was female-headed households, for a particular reason. So but it was luck, right? I mean, and so you need a theory as to how big you think that difference is going to be. I think that's hard to predict. And so you can try and do that, but then I think at the end you have to say we were set up to detect this difference, right? Because that's where the honesty comes. Okay, this, I ran this regression on gender in this paper in Kenya, one of those papers I talked about, and if you look at what they were powered to detect, it would have been huge. It would have had to been huge. It wasn't. So that's the sort of ex post planning and ex ante saying, well, this is what we could have found. On the question on the disadvantaged groups, I don't want to go more into it, but one very important note to put on it is thinking about it in the sampling design, right? Because I think before you start the evaluation, you have to think very clearly about what are the groups you want to measure and make sure they're well represented in the sample, particularly if you're trying to get like an average effect for the program folks, but also want to get enough of those people in your survey so that you can answer that, and that's going to require not just a simple sample. To my colleague from Togo, I hear your pain. I've heard it from others. My suggestion would be one way to approach it would be to figure out which are the groups that I want to focus on. Okay, so let's say I want to focus on the extreme poor. What do they do? Okay, in Togo we know, the data's there to figure that out. So the ultra poor, what are they doing? Okay, let's say, I haven't looked at the Togo data recently, but let's say they're rural smallholders. Then I think then you go out and you say, what is the evidence? And let's say I want to raise their income. Okay, I'm just using one very particular example. What is the evidence on what increases rural smallholder income? That's hard to find, okay, because there's lots of systematic reviews by people who are of a certain group, okay? I'm in agriculture. Well, you had a meeting at FAO on this, and it's fascinating. The agriculture people only summarize agriculture programs, but it may be that a health program is really good at increasing income for rural smallholders. So I think you need to, you can do it, it just requires a bit more work, but looking at the evidence that's based on the outcome you care about rather than the program type that you care about. And as a Ministry of Planning, this is where you might save us, right? Because the Agriculture Ministry only knows how to do agriculture programs. And the Health Ministry only knows how to do health programs. But it may be that an agriculture program is better for a particular health indicator. And it's your job, hopefully, to tell the government that. You and the Ministry of Finance is the only hope we have. And then I think it's a dynamic process. So we have not a lot of evaluations in Togo, as you know. There's some, but so then I'm going to try these 4 things which look promising in Togo, and we're going to learn from them, and we're going to learn at different times. C'est la vie, ça. And then we're going to adapt and go forward and try new things.
These are a very interesting set of questions. In terms of talking to the donor about sample sizes and trying to get them to pay for an evaluation where you have enough power, I've found I'm an economist, but I work very closely with nutritionists. So we find it very helpful to use some of the biological indicators such as nutrition, growth, to calibrate sample sizes and just be realistic about whether you can detect certain effects within certain age ranges. And I think because I think you had mentioned that for some cases where the response, say, of women is just so large that you have a smaller, you only require a smaller sample size. But in some cases you're still guessing, especially if these are outcomes for which you haven't done a lot of evaluations. But I think that there has been a lot of study of the biology of certain groups and certain age ranges that I think that nutritionists are actually, and health, public health people are much better at calibrating their sample sizes than those of us doing more behavioral stuff. I really like that question about disadvantaged groups and what data you need to collect to be able to look at the type of disadvantage. So in the old days, when we were starting to do impact evaluations of CCTs in Latin America, the question of effects on indigenous peoples was always a big question mark that was very politically sensitive. And we wanted to collect ethnicity data, but we were told that it was quite sensitive. So we asked, the proxy question was, what language do you speak at home? But it was, these sensitivities exist. We have to, I think we are aware of them, but hopefully can try to find a way around them. The question about these multisectoral evaluations, I think, is very interesting, and we're seeing a lot of them. I mean, at IFPRI, we see a lot of them because we work on agriculture and nutrition. And so it enables us to look at interventions for, like, the one I talked about, which in Bangladesh, which involves a nutrition intervention, a credit intervention, a nutrition intervention, an extension intervention, and a gender sensitization. I can't even pronounce that word, intervention, required us to work with different implementing agencies and different groups. Now, this is being implemented by BRAC, but we're also doing a similar program with the Ministry of Agriculture. And boy, the contortions you have to do to get even different branches of the same ministry, the livestock people and the crops people, to work together is quite phenomenal. So I really sympathize with our colleague from Togo. It's a tough job, but it's something we're going to have to learn from and deal with.
And how much that is possible. And also, for example, like in South Africa, we have a panel survey. So using that type of information.
Agnes, Marcus, and Roxanne, you're not only researchers, you're also program managers. And you've been involved in the kind of research you've been doing for a long time. So what I'd like to know is, how do you, as managers of programs, how do you judge whether the research that you've been doing for several years have actually changed, have had an impact on research on gender? How have your research over the years changed research methodology, plus, not to mention, program design, and also policy?
This is Youssef from the West African Development Bank. My concern is about the multi-intervention. My bank intervened in different projects, especially different development projects in a rural area in West Africa. But what happens sometimes when we need to do these evaluations, it's happened that, let's say in agriculture, my bank intervened in irrigation, and maybe the African Development Bank intervened in agriculture in the same zone, and the French, the IFD intervene as well. Now, when we go back and we try to see the impact of my bank intervention in the area, or in the rising of women's income, let's say we're trying to evaluate the rising of women income. So how can we evaluate that? How can we know that the woman income has raised because of BYD intervention? Because IFD was there as well. Other development agencies were there. They all intervened in the same time. So how can we know that the change happened was from BYD intervention? Thank you very much.
Great questions. So in the administrative data, I think it really depends in that it's very challenging because administrative data often reflects the very same inequalities that we're trying to examine. So what do I mean by that? If IDs are required to register and men are more likely to have IDs, or if you get IDs by virtue of being in the military or completing a certain level of education, you're reflecting those same inequalities. So it can give you a starting point. I don't know how good of a starting point it can give you by this sense of critical power. And that's where I think it's okay to use it, but problematizing who makes it into the administrative data, on what basis, who doesn't. Another good example is marriage, right? If you're in a country that does not recognize anything but heterosexual marriage, who counts as being in the married category or is living in the same household in the administrative data, and what types of power dynamics and relationships aren't captured by that. On the program manager question, that is really tough in that, you know, the patriarchy is still alive and well, so clearly we haven't done our job by that measure. So feminist scholar Cynthia Enlow has asked my favorite question on this, which is, whom do you want to be taken seriously by? And that's the impact question for me. If we do a really good job on gender analysis, who changes their behavior, in which direction, and how? So a couple of things. I believe in the gardening theory of social change, of plant a seed and watch it grow. So some things we've seen shift is sharing methods practices, so sharing rubrics, saying at a minimum, this is what your gender data collection should look like. Secondly, not just collecting the gender data, but analyzing it. We're sitting on a lot of gender data because of this checkmark approach that I was talking about before, where it's like you needed to collect it, you collected it, you ticked the box, but you didn't analyze it, you didn't publish it, you didn't report on it, which is not really helping anybody change their behavior. So as a program manager, holding us accountable to not writing a paper without a gender analysis, regardless of whether the paper is explicitly about gender or not, is another big intervention. Third, I would say as a peer reviewer, and this happens a lot and annoys people a lot, where I'll be asked to review a paper and the paper will not discuss gender whatsoever. They will say impacts of this water and sanitation intervention on people are blah, 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 asking who are people and did they experience the impact equally and in the same way? So getting colleagues to either do the gender analysis or say that the data isn't there, I think improves the field. And I'll leave the question of attribution to my colleagues. It's a really important one, and you've both done really great work on it, and you have much more to say on this than I do.
Thanks. Okay, Ian, so I think it always sounds easier than it. Everyone's like, oh, you can use administrative data. Oh, there's existing surveys. And it can work, okay? But I think it's harder than we always think at the beginning. So on administrative data, we're doing an HIV work where we're linking survey data and medical records. We had 5 ways to make sure that link happened, and 4 of them failed. Right? So good thing we had 5. I didn't know that was the right number when we started. Now we're doing another one where we're linking bank administrative data with the survey. And here we enrolled them in the bank, so that helped to make that link in the first case. What's interesting here, and this goes back to a point Roxanne mentioned earlier, is they're giving us different numbers when we ask them how much money they have in the bank. And they gave us permission to look at their bank records. so those differences are interesting, I think, to understand what's behind there. So getting to 2 ways in some cases is instructive. The existing surveys, again, the matching I think is often harder than we think. Everyone's like, oh, the households are geocoded. Yeah, I hope you have a lot of money to have somebody program that up, and then they'll discover a bunch of them are in the Indian Ocean. But it can be done. Again, I think there the risk is that the sample is going to be too small in the program areas. So there, sometimes what I've seen people do is pay for an oversample, pay to add questions. The problem you run into there is, negotiating with a group with a national stats agency that's doing a survey is fraught with politics, and you're from South Africa, I don't have to tell you, but it's true in all countries. Mauritania, this country. So there's a lot of constituencies. There's a lot of donors often coming with money. So I think people underestimate the amount of time they're going to have to spend arguing with people on all of these. But once you know that, you can make it work. So Beth, I think, look, it's really hard to attribute the impacts of research generally. And I think the general point here, you know, and so the donors, you can close your ears for this part of the conversation. 'Cause, I think, look, really good research uptake is when people own the idea and they think it's their idea. And it at least partially is. That's fantastic to me. That's what I want my research to do. But then asking them to say, hey, I got that idea from you so I can report it back to my funder, undermines the process, right? I've had this happen with one of the governments I'm working with. They're like, we knew, you didn't do anything. And I'm like, that's good. And so I think there's a tension there. You know, I understand from a donor's point of view, they need to tell the taxpayers that as a taxpayer, I care about this. So we can't just let the research folks get off the hook on getting the evidence used. So what we did, we have a team of about 20 people working in my group at the bank, and we got everyone to sit around the table and tell their stories, and tried to understand what was going on, and we added it up. And then we don't share that report too widely. Right? We want to know this for our sakes, but we also don't want to undermine people's ownership of these ideas, I guess. Youssef, so I think, so the way you're talking about evaluation, I think part of the answer is this is why you need a control group. And you don't need an RCT, but you need to understand how these other programs were targeted. And you need to measure that in your survey, the participation in these other programs. I mean, that's the short answer. It's much longer, but you can do it. I mean, the world is never a static place. And so measuring these other interventions and understanding to the extent you can, it's not your job, the interactions, and what may be positive, what may be negative. That's critical. And that requires understanding their targeting, which good luck getting some people to tell you how they targeted a program and what actually happened. And measuring that in the survey, and then designing the evaluation so that you can tease out your program's additional effects.
The question on administrative data, I'd like to point out that there are other sources of administrative data which are not necessarily based on the indicators which could involve some discriminatory screening or discriminatory identification. So, for example, my colleagues working on, say, climate change have been using satellite pictures of forest cover and vegetation, and then and since that's been collected over time, matching that to georeferenced household data. So there are other sources of spatial data that we can use, which are quite helpful. Panel data, I think, are quite useful, or can be quite useful, to look at policy change over time. But I think there's an element of luck there. I mean, you just hope and pray that your panel data were collected before and after a major policy change, and you're not always lucky. But there have been a number of studies which have exploited panel data to do that. Beth's question on attribution is a tricky one because we always have problems with attribution, and because you want to build ownership, as Marcus said, you can't take too much credit for the influence that you have. I guess there are ways of tracking things through citations and things like that. But that said, at IFPRI we are forced to measure our impact, and I really hate it. So please don't tell my bosses this. We do this grudgingly, but we have to do it because we have to raise money, and we sort of try to look at whether certain indicators, as suggested by our research, has been adopted and used. We do find this. We do find some evidence of programs that have been modified based on our findings. So, for example, I'm one of the co-PIs of the Gender, Agriculture, and Assets Project, GAP 2 now, which has started with GAP 1, where we worked with agricultural development agencies to look at how their programs have changed the gender asset gap. And we have seen some changes in the way some programs have been designed based on their interaction with us. But could we actually claim that it's because of us? It's really a bit too much hubris to claim that. And the last question on multi-sectoral programs and what you do if you have many programs happening at the same time, I agree with Marcos that the control group is really very important. We've seen so many cases where people have tried to... we work a lot with NGOs evaluating programs. And these are programs which often have multiple treatment arms, so they're bundled programs. And in many cases, they just simply refuse to have a comparison group. And it makes it very difficult to attribute impact to any of those bundles or even to the program itself. And I've seen some pushback from some major donors who are telling the NGOs that, we really can't fund you on this scale unless you do a proper evaluation. But it's very hard. It's hard to convince implementers as well.